The ISAN Dunderland project was born from my personal and professional experience where the arts function as a powerful tool. The arts enable us to know ourselves, to discover inner resources that help us survive the very worst times of our lives: grief, overwhelming stress, hopelessness. A pivotal point in my career as an art therapist was working with an 11-year-old boy in foster care who told me he'd been re-diagnosed with ADHD, prescribed Ritalin, and was self-harming. I knew that there was no mention of self-harm in his previous case records. I knew that ADHD is a debatable diagnosis and that the diagnostic criteria could fit any one of us. I took my concerns to the foster care agency and included research to support my concerns. I knew from both my own experience and research and listening to the stories of many people around the globe that psych medications, particularly in young children, could have very grave consequences, including suicide and homicide. I knew that a Google Scholar search of the terms medication-induced suicide, homicide, yields about 18,400 results. I knew that some kids end up selling their Ritalin in the schoolyard. I knew that Ritalin can become a gateway drug. I knew that medicating emotions in a child is unlikely to teach them to learn to handle their emotions. I knew from my own experience of taking antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications after the death of my mother, my very best friend in the world, how horrendous the side effects could be. And I knew that, at the time I experienced these side effects, I had no inkling whatsoever that they were medication-induced. I believed, as do most people, that the exacerbation of my symptoms meant that my depression and anxiety were getting worse. I tried to imagine a little 11-year-old boy with a background of trauma experiencing the deep level of dread and constant anxiety every single day that was my experience of depression and anxiety that I now know were exacerbated by the medications. Ultimately, huge body tremors, a sensation of microbes crawling under my skin, were the physical sensations that made me think I was going mad. I knew that part of this young boy felt unloved because he told me and showed me with his drawings and storytelling, and he didn't care if he lived or died. I knew that the mental health system and education system provides more money for support if a child has a diagnosis. I knew that not all foster care parents foster children for money, but that some do. I knew that all the information I had was readily available to anyone who could use the internet, including an 11-year-old boy. In bringing together the following 6 speakers through the Alice in Dunderland Truth-Telling and Consequences Looking Glass, it's a reflection and a reminder that this story happens to so many people and can happen to any of us. In sharing these stories, we aim to raise awareness in hope of preventing any further unnecessary damage.
Arguably, the pharmaceutical industry is the most powerful industry in the world. So it's very hard to take on that type of giant. It's really difficult. So we all have to work together collaboratively. And as we do share our stories, and I believe there's power in the stories, I really do. One of the reasons why I'm speaking up probably more now than ever before. My role is just to share my story, because when I was distressed, I crashed very quickly. I lost weight and was prescribed Paxil. My doctor really didn't know anything about how to wean someone off of a drug. When you get a prescription, they don't tell you the possibility that you can become suicidal. And that warning has been out in Canada since 2004, just before I wound up taking my son's life. Those warnings were starting to come out. Yet the drug companies knew about this in the 90s when they were doing their clinical trials. They just hid the data to get the drugs approved. My case is a homicide, and it's excruciating. I can't think of much more, heinous than taking your own child's life. You never recover. I just blindly trusted my doctor. Most of what they learn is from the pharmaceutical sales reps. And we know there's a high percentage of doctors that are consultants. Still, it's happening now where they do get some funds from the pharmaceutical industry. If you're depressed or you're having a rough time, we know that, yes, some people become suicidal. So if the drug makes you suicidal, the doctor is very easy to say, no, it's part of the condition. Or if you suddenly become really agitated, irritated, here, take this drug. This will help calm you down. This leads towards polypharmacy, and this leads towards lifelong issues. I think there are too many people on too many drugs.
Yeah.
And I do really think that there's an awakening about these issues. Medical professionals that have had the courage to speak out. Well, I think many people have stepped back and wondered if maybe their drugs are doing more harm than good. My silence in July 2006 as a forensic inpatient in a psychiatric hospital what I had found was a purpose that would keep me alive, a purpose that would hopefully help prevent other family tragedies like ours. So Know Your Drugs is a global awareness campaign. In the presentation I deliver, I call Preventing Another Opioid Crisis. We talk about a study called 329. Our main message in this campaign is you've got to research the side effects so you can understand if the side effects might be caused by the drug. And I hope we create some healthy skepticism about the pharmaceutical industry. We need prescription drugs. This is where we're aligned with an organization called risk.org, risk.org. We can find out, maybe this is a side effect, maybe this isn't, your condition or your illness. Or if that's the case, really clear case of causality. And the way that the pharmaceutical industry works is they will say there's no scientific evidence that, for example, Paxil or Paxil cause psychosis. That's one of the things they've said, or homicide. Well, that scientific evidence is just based on their clinical trials. It's not science. So all of our reports, what they call post-marketing experiences, they almost consider to be anecdotal. But to me, that's better science than their own clinical trial. But we need to report them, really build the scientific or the evidence base, and then we need to hold the government regulators accountable. So I think we just have to stop blindly trusting our doctors. People have to start asking questions, because too many people are just finding out about the harm these drugs can do after they've lost a loved one or been harmed themselves. And we really have to move towards allowing people to make informed choices about prescription drug use.
Some of my aunt seems to have this very childlike, simplistic view of the world, and I think that's what I sort of incorporate into my life at home. I became very disillusioned with the education system and the supports that were meant to be in place and that weren't in place. For so many years, I thought I was unbreakable because I was educated, because I was a teacher, because I could multitask, because I could juggle so many things going on in my life. I had this theory I would have the ability to keep myself together, though realistically I was falling apart and didn't realise I was. I had that belief where I was unbreakable, so when I did break and my resilience just fell away, it was a huge shock. I stopped becoming this very outgoing, bubbly person and started to withdraw into myself quite a fair bit, and it felt like I was wearing a mask or having two faces. This happy person, but on the other side, this person that's so fearful of things and cautious of things that it was a struggle between what face was I going to put on that day. Like trying to mask things and say that they weren't as bad as what they were. The world as I had known just stopped. Even though it was sort of like a dark point in my life, I feel more calm and settled because I'm starting to understand myself more, be able to navigate myself through mental health a lot better. Just sort of floating between a world that stopped and there is freedom. And I've got little dark figures, these symbols, because even though we can have, the darkness in the corner trying to get to us, there is freedom. I feel like I'm sort of contented. I do understand that I have to look after myself and that my mental health is more important. I need to be the best person that I can be, because I feel that my quality of life is so much better now than when I was first diagnosed. And I think art has definitely played a part in that. It's definitely allowed me to see that I can see just how much I have improved.
And it's about getting, Alice back up the burrow, and how do you do that? Consumer movement or the peer movement is, in essence, a social justice and human rights movement to try and shift the balance from that biomedical approach that is entrenched in Western mental health systems. And it's about shifting that back to looking at what's happened to people. Also, looking at those strengths and beauties of people and allowing them to, value that diversity that we have. It's about recognising that often these current systems cause a lot of the so-called problems with mental health in terms of morbidity. Creativity has been a really essential part of my recovery and still is. I still write poetry. My personal experiences of mental health issues, whatever you want to call them, I became more awake, I suppose, and not able to sleep. And this was in 1983, which was around the time of a number of global tensions happening. At the time I was beginning to move into a different space, and that space was around a belief that I had to live past my birthday, otherwise the world would end. And I'd constructed that sort of belief. I thought I was moving out of the discomfort of that phase where I wasn't coping with life and moving into a place where I was very much in control of. I was getting into life in a new way. So I probably was, in a sense, discovering myself, moving from what I had been to what I was becoming as a person. In that place, I was writing my memoir, which was pretty pretentious at a young age. It began with the title "Don't Go to School with a Hangover and Lie on the Classroom Floor," and ended up with the title "The Newest Testament." So it might give you an indication of where I was going. Part of all of this move into this idea that I had to live past my birthday was also sort of messianic type beliefs starting to happen, that I had some control over the destiny of the world moving through a time of turmoil and trouble into a time of paradise, sort of like the rapture. So I ended up in mental health units and actually felt that was good, because at that time I needed sanctuary and safety. And those forces of evil that were out to get me couldn't get me in that hospital. And so I ended up, coming out of hospital still in a heightened state and still with all sorts of connections to the world and my environments wherever I was. You really feel them, nature, you're at one with nature. You can perceive things, you can read things through number plates, you can commune with animals more easily, and you have these sorts of powers. I was given a diagnosis of schizophrenia at that time. In my mind, there was this connection to the world and the universe at a higher space where I really did feel things I felt differently to other people. I think, for me, art, the visual arts, poetry, writing, they're also so important.
I guess I wanted to right some wrongs, possibly naively, whereas as that goes on into developing a skill set around achieving the best results, you realise it's hard work to right wrongs. And it doesn't take very long for human beings to forget a certain era if they weren't there. And in the case of the Iraq War, it became clear in 2002 that the Bush administration was determined to expand its operations from Afghanistan post 9/11 into Iraq and invade Iraq. And the arguments for weapons of mass destruction were just never cutting it at any level. And all of the world could see it and used all of those processes at a UN and international diplomatic level to prevent it, yet failed. And as the failure of that became apparent, a grassroots movement developed, a bit of a final cry of defiance from, at least this end of the world, where 70% of the Australian population opposed the deployment of troops as part of the coalition of the willing. Will said he had this tin of paint and he wanted to paint a message against the war, and he asked me where would the best place to put it, and literally as a semi-joking and to make him think, I said, well, on top of the sails of the Opera House. And I saw him draw a breath and went, wow, Will's actually taking this suggestion seriously. And we were both pretty angry at what was going on, like the rest of the world with our son. He saw the consequences more than anyone. going to school and people go, what does your dad do? And he goes, oh, he leaves his buildings and he goes to jail. I mean, as we're seeing, right now, there's global despair or panic, and people, as we're seeing, are turning to a great deal of misinformation to comfort themselves or to simplify the problems in their own heads. The first thing is you've got to be comfortable that it's not simple, and it comes to the sheer numbers of being better than the industry you're taking on, rather than the moral issues of wrong and right. You've actually got to outwit them and provide a solution.
Psychiatry has taken another wrong turn. It took a wrong turn when it did 100,000 lobotomies, believing that pills can sort out emotional problems, believing that we can change people's minds and make them happy when they perhaps should be unhappy. But it's not how we view ourselves, it's how psychiatrists view people, how the pharmaceutical industry has taught them to view people. When huge amounts of fines are paid in the United States under the False Claims Act, for instance, 1.42 billion, the first federal settlement for Zyprexa, it gets into the financial pages here. And I've discovered that my colleagues don't read. More than a third of our admissions to that ward were people on antidepressants and antipsychotics who were suicidal, homicidal. It never had been like that before, and they've been given them for stress. And the epidemics followed the blitzes by the drug companies. So for a few weeks, you'd have a whole lot of paroxetine suicides coming in, then a whole lot of Zoloft suicides coming in. The trinkets would appear on the tables, and I couldn't work out what it was, because I was reading product information in Australia, which is 1/3 the size of that given to American doctors. I was seeing the suicidality, and I couldn't make sense of it. And then I went to David Healy's and gave a paper on Let Them Eat Prozac. And in those 2 hours, something happened to me that has never happened before. My whole professional life and professional failures just went through my mind. And the feeling was as if I had been putting together 3 jigsaw puzzles. And when David's take-home message was drug companies are lying to you, then all that information from drug companies was removed, and everything else fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle. And it was a magical experience, and it solved my confusion. I then learned, Yola, believe what you see in front of you, believe what you learned as an undergraduate, and don't take no notice of these lying doctors and lying professors. It's a St. Paul to Damascus kind of, everything makes sense. It's the drug stupid,
The seeds sprout that really develop a whole different way of responding to people. The revolution happens from people understanding a different narrative, making real life practical changes, and here's the key. And as they do so, their narrative is founded in truth. Do we really think that all your distress arises just from your brain chemistry? We respond to environment. Once we see that, and once we say, well, listen, I don't just exist like a mind walking apart from the environment and my mind being depressed or whatever, we know that's nonsense. We respond to the environment. So once you see that, you say like, okay, you go out and like get these new seeds sprouting that show different ways. Understanding of what science is really showing us, what philosophy is really showing us, what personal experience shows us, what history shows us, what literature shows us, all that shows us. It's in this alternative narrative, this counter narrative, where we see what we know to be true about human beings. This other narrative gets understood and gets promoted, even in whatever circles. And then seeds of practice are changed. It helps people reform their own self-conception. And you have things like Soteria Israel, you have things like open dialogue, you have medication-free places in Norway, you have respite houses showing up. So there are these seeds being planted. And you get these little pockets where the conception of what's happening is very different. Even within the mainstream academic community, there is an acknowledgement that their story that they wanted to tell 30 years ago has fallen apart. Diagnoses haven't been validated as real illnesses. So that whole biological story that was presented to us beginning in the 1980s, they have to admit there's an increasing admission that it didn't pan out. And that opens the shift for a paradigm, at least a change in conversation and all. That said, I'm pretty pessimistic when it comes to changing the existing system. And now we hope that they just don't get crushed by the mainstream. But you can't change existing systems where people are benefiting and have power from that. What you have to do is plant new seeds. I'm quite sure of that.